Okay, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is John Osana, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. And today's webinar is titled, Can Prescribed Fire Help Forests Survive Drought in the Sierra Nevada Mountains? And very pertinent, obviously, and also this is the last of the drought series, so be on the lookout for the next series that we're going to be holding, but I can't believe it's already through with this. So, let's get started. To start things off, please join me in welcoming Sean Carter with the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, who will be introducing our speaker today. Sean?
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah, it's with a little bit of a tight throat and tear in my eye that I welcome you to our last series, installment of this series on ecological drought. But we have a great talk lined up today, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. James Thorne, who's adjunct faculty and research scientist at the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. And he has expertise in biogeography, conservation biology, and ecology. And some of his recent work is focused on the success of forest thinning and tree health, and also vulnerability assessments for mammals, trees, and vegetation types in California. He has his degrees in ecology from UC Davis, and also degrees in geology from UC Santa Barbara and environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz. So without further ado, the floor is yours, James.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to present to the group. Welcome to everybody online. John, Sean, Elda, thank you for your invitation. And so we'll just dive right in. I need to recognize my co-PIs and collaborators on this project, including Phil Van Mancham from the U.S. Geological Survey and a whole list of people that you see down there at the bottom of this particular slide, many of whom this work would not have been possible without their collaboration and good help. This presentation comes out of a project that's funded by the U.S. Geological Climate Science Center, Southwest Climate Science Center, and we wanted to try to take advantage of the drought in California to examine whether forest treatments led to better forest condition as the drought progressed. And as much as this is a results project or presentation, it's going to probably be more about the project itself, because we're still in the process of developing our final results. And it's taking place in California, Sierra Nevada. I'm sitting right now at that little red star over in Davis, and California, oh, oops, got to use the down arrow. Oh, you know, we wanted to basically see if the canopy, if we could measure tree condition to be healthier via remote sensing in areas that have been treated versus not treated. As you know, California's drought was a very intensive one and has led to the direct or indirect mortality of many millions of trees. And one of the reasons that it was a more intensive drought than many of the droughts that are in our historical record that we can observe is because it was much warmer. So here you see minimum temperatures and how they really climbed during the 2013 to 2016 period at the same time that we had remarkable decreases in the amount of precipitation. And so to try to take advantage of this terrible thing, we wanted to do a large mashup of different types of information. So this slide is really sort of here's the progression of the talk slide. And we have a remote sensing component, we have a plot-based component, we have a leaf-based component, and a GIS mashup. And we want to try to combine all of those. And I'll walk you through that a bit, and I'm going to then talk about the results from a number of different spatial scales. So we have there are these two flight boxes that have been, in which hyperspectral data has been flown every year for now 5 years going on 6 years, starting in 2013. And each box is about 13,000 square kilometers. One of them covers from the Central Valley of California up over the Sierras and the Lake Tahoe Basin, and the other includes a transect that includes most of Yosemite National Park, as you can see there. And so at those areas, fixed-wing aircraft flew and took Avers Plus data, which has just under 300 bands of recording, and at 18 meters. So what we wanted to do then is to, here you can see them laid out against the national forests and national parks in the Sierras. We wanted to try to use those data in conjunction with other types of land management that was brought in through GIS, and in some cases with LIDAR data, to look at differences in canopy water content in places that have been treated or not. So on this slide you can see the yellow flight boxes, and then the red are locations where we know LIDAR was flown at one point or another that might be able to be used to look at structure. And then on the left inset you can see some brown and orange polygons, and those would be representative of locations where prescribed fire or mechanical thinning had been applied. And so those locations would represent places where perhaps trees might be less impacted by the increasing ratcheting of the drought stress than in other places which had not been treated and therefore had sort of a continuation of the 70 years of fire suppression and denser stands than we might expect otherwise. So 3 of these sites, oh, I should jump back for just a second. I guess it doesn't show on that one. 3 of these sites form an elevational transect that we looked at for a local level approach. And so I tried to break up the landscape and our analysis approach into 3 spatial scales: a local level or stand level, a mesoscale, which I'll show you in a minute, and then a full landscape scale. So at the stand level, we looked at these 3 locations: a San Joaquin experimental range, a soaproot saddle, which is mid-elevation, and a Teakettle experimental forest, which is getting up into the upper elevations of conifers in the Sierra Nevada. And at Teakettle, in the upper level, where it's predominantly red fir, white fir forest, there's a 10-year ongoing experiment that is overseen by Malcolm North of the U.S. Forest Service, and they have these 10-acre blocks, and the 10-acre blocks represent, the different colors here represent different treatments that have been applied. So they have 3 replicates for a control, or for overstory thinning, or understory thinning, or burned, prescribed burned with understory thinning or overstory thinning. And we thought, okay, well, here's a place where this is about as good as we can get. We know what the prescriptions have been, and we know pretty well where these locations are. And we have LIDAR for this location. So let's look at that in more detail and see if and we used it as a location to develop some of the methods for the analyses. And so here's an image of the LIDAR from those locations. And so each of these boxes has 3 lines in it representing the 3 plots at that location. And as you go to the right on the x-axis, you're going to increasing height, and the vertical is the proportion of the canopy that is at that height. And so the upper left, understory thinning, we can see that there's actually quite a bit, even though the understory was thinned, there's quite a bit of material to the left of the 15-meter height line, which in this case, is shrubs that grew back. But we can see some differences. So for example, the right-hand side prescribed burn with overstory thinning, you don't see a hump out to the right end, which would be where the larger tree canopies would be more frequent. So we can see that the different treatments show a slightly different structural profile at this location. And this image basically is showing the combinations of three colors are the amount of NDWI, normalized difference water index, it's to NDVI, and you can see that it ratchets down from 2013 to 2015, and then each column or each collection of three is a different plot with treatments. And the message that we got when we did this was that, yeah, we could see a loss of canopy water by this index. And by the way, the NDWI is a unitless index, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We could see it ratcheting down, but unfortunately there was almost as much noise within the treatments as there was among the treatments. And so it was a little bit unsatisfactory with regards to, we were hoping that, you know, perhaps a prescribed burn with an understory thin would come out at losing less water overall than others, and we weren't really able to show that. And so then we asked, well, why might that be that, you know, we know that things have dried down, and I think one of the answers might be visible in this series of images. So the upper row is the location where the Teakettle experimental forest is located in those red squares. And you can see that those three images in green, the green stays about the same level of saturation. It gets slightly paler through time, but that's telling us that this entire area is not drying down as much as we might expect under the drought. And by contrast, the lower row, which is at our lowest elevation site in the San Joaquin experimental station and is an oak savanna, you can see the green is really paling out quite a bit, and the intensity of the red in the right-hand image is much heavier. So that's showing us that there's a much greater impact of decline in this index of canopy water at that location than there was at the Teakettle location. And, you know, we came around to noticing that the Teakettle location sits somewhat in a topographic bowl. And so there may be some groundwater dynamics that are going on at this location that buffer it, that essentially insulate it from the increasing effect of the drought. Okay, well, let's take a look at the mesoscale approach then. So here's our two flight boxes, and the red and yellow little candy wrappers that are out there, since it's Halloween. Those represent locations where we tried to match places that had had a prescribed burn or a mechanical thin that were available via GIS data with matching locations that had the same vegetation and slope that had not been treated. And so here's what that might look like. So it's essentially a paired plot or a paired polygon type of an analysis. So here in the lower image is a burn from 2008, a prescribed burn, and nearby, not terribly far away, a control of about the same area, same vegetation type, same elevation, similar slope aspect. And so we want to start to compare these things in some sort of a paired plot approach. And so it gets a little complicated because you have prescribed burns in many different years, and you have the image years of 2013, 14, and 15. And what we would expect to see, or our hypothesis is illustrated in the right-hand most column. So there's 2011, and you can see that there's a burn and a control column there. And we would hope that there would be water canopy content would be, the red shows the sort of the opposite of what we would expect. We would hope that the prescribed burn would have a higher water canopy content than the control. And for 2011, the control had a higher canopy water content than the burn. But if you look at the far left, it's doing more what we would expect. The burn has a slightly higher value than the control for each of the 3 years at that location. And so what this suggests is that the timing, the historical timing by year of a treatment might have an effect on forests given the onset of a drought. So if you did a prescribed burn and that same summer it went into a drought, well, the trees might have become somewhat stressed by the prescribed burn and be adversely impacted, whereas perhaps if the burn was several years prior, it would be a better solution. So we were also not terribly happy with this initial set of results from burns and treatments because they seemed quite noisy as well. It may be also that because we're going across a large elevational gradient, which we'll talk about in a moment, that the same treatments could have different health effects depending on the level of background stress that a location is subjected to. So now let's move up to the landscape approach. And so at the landscape approach, we learned that it takes a long time to process hyperspectral imagery to be at the point where you can look across pixels from year to year and have the same 18-meter pixels lining up across 13,000 square kilometers. And indeed, you can see here, there are flight lines, and there's about 11 or 12 flight lines in each box. And we had to take each flight line, which was georeferenced by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but we had to further georeference them by cutting each flight line into small pieces and locking it onto the landscape and then locking the years from one to the next. At the landscape scale, there's some things that I see that make me confident that we could use these data at this spatial scale. So the first is on the left image here. You can see that down in the valley at the bottom of the box, the canopy water index for a single year is drier in browns and reds, and then it moves into blue colors in our conifer zone, which is a more productive and moister zone. And then as you get to the other side of the Sierras and into Nevada, past Lake Tahoe, you can see that it dries down again. So the major moisture gradient of these mountains is captured by these images. And also on the right-hand image, you can see in the back behind those three flight lines is the vegetation map for this area, derived from other satellite imagery. And the patterns that we see in the hyperspectral imagery and the patterns of the vegetation line up very well. So that also suggests to me that we could do things, we could look at this by different vegetation type, different forest type. We go from oak savannas to mixed conifer hardwood to conifers to subalpine conifers. And we could probably look at all of those in turn and see what type of dynamics they display. So here's what one of our rendered images of the multiple flight lines looks like for what I call the Tahoe box. And the nice thing about the NDWI is although it's unitless, and we've tried to address that, I'll present that in a minute, it does allow you to compare from one location to another and across years because it's all on a single index. So here's the change from 2013 to 2015. The tannish colors show the drying down. There's some spackling in that. And then there's some, the white locations are places where there was cloud or snow cover and we weren't able to calculate the differences for those particular combination of years. And here's the same image, again, now with some of the wildfires for this region overlaid on it. So what you can see here is where the intense red is located in the left side of this image is the King Fire, and the King Fire took place during this sequence, and some of the greatest drying down are within the footprint of that wildfire. So we can start to bring in things like the wildfires and perhaps other disturbances and look at them in relationship to these types of data. So now, we've switched over to the Yosemite box. You can see Mono Lake in the upper right-hand side. And here's the 2014 and 2015 images side by side. The stars are our field locations, and we're going to come back to those in just a minute. And you can see that there are the band of blue that's above that heavy red in the left image is paling out and getting much less pronounced by 2015. And so that would be the increasing sequence of the drought. And here's the change in canopy water content. So we can see that almost the entire location is moving into into drier condition rather than into wetter condition. And again, I've put the prescribed fires on there with the crosshatch black locations, and they match up pretty well with the heavy-duty red emerging locations. So one of the things that we're planning to do with these data are to develop a topographic model. There's a scientist named Jennifer Cartwright who works with the U.S. Geological Survey, and she's using these types of imagery along with topographic modeling to try and identify where refugia are located on the landscape, within the drought. And so we think we can do that here, that we could either create a topographic model not using any of these data, but say here's where we think the least impacted locations will be for each vegetation type, and then look at the change in the canopy water index at those locations. Or we could actually use the imagery to say where are the locations that had the least impact and go in and look at what conditions are at those locations. So that's currently the major thrust of the research. So I've talked about the remote sensing and the 3 scales of analysis, but we also have tried to address the issue that the NDWI is unitless, and it would be nice to know what the millimeters of water in a canopy were. And while we were doing this project, we originally were only going to process 3 years, but we learned that NASA decided to fly the imagery again in 2016, and indeed they're actually going for another several years. And so in 2016, we fielded a field campaign to get out on the ground and try and, did it skip the picture? To get out on the ground and try to collect information about leaf water potential and field measurements of the spectral indices of trees so that we could come up with a canopy water content that was derived in the field at the same time that the planes were doing the overflights, and then we could link the values from the field to the remotely sensed ones, and that would get us to getting to some actual measurement of the canopy water content. So here are some of the folks who worked on that project, and we collected from these 4 sites in June of 2016, the Blodgett Forest, the San Joaquin, Teakettle, and soaproot. Notice all of the tree mortality at the soaproot level elevation. And again, those are an elevational transect. And we collected leaf reflectance, leaf water content, leaf mass, leaf thickness, water potential from pre-dawn and midday, and at the leaf level and at the canopy level, leaf area index, canopy cover or gap fraction, and species and tree data. And we would lay out a 9-unit plot, and within that 3 plots would be selected and 4 dominant trees would be measured in each of those locations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 elevational locations, starting at the San Joaquin experimental range, which is the lowest elevation one. And here we have 2 species of oaks, the blue oak and valley oak, and the lowest elevation pine. And we can see that the water potential versus leaf water content of the pine and the oaks are quite different, and that the leaf water content against the normalized difference water index as measured in the field is also quite different. This is the location at which our results are the most far along. So leaf water content against the NDWI is showing less of a distinct pattern. But for the oaks, we can actually identify our 3 different plots show us that topographic position is an important consideration for the condition of the canopy of those trees. So you can see these 3 groups are broken out here, and that they have different topographic position. And we were able to use that with some repeat plot data to identify mortality that is associated with the drying down of the remote sensing. So the little red circles here are showing you the 9 locations that we have field measurements for, repeated field measurements for, and then the imagery, and that there is a fairly good correspondence between the percentage of dead trees and the canopy water decrease that is shown in the statistical chart there. Now, this is particularly of interest at the low elevation in these blue oaks, because blue oaks may have, they probably have less pathogens and pests that are attacking them than is occurring at higher elevations. At higher elevations, the predominant cause of the mortality has been beetle outbreaks, and so it's hard to get to a direct physiological link to mortality. But at this lowest elevation in the driest, hottest places, we think that we might be closer to identifying the physiological tolerance of these trees. If we jump up to the middle elevation, here there's 5 different species, and they array themselves pretty well with regards to water potential and leaf water content. And they also break out fairly well of leaf water content against the handheld NDWI. So in this case, we might be able to go after dynamics with the individual trees. However, our 18-meter pixel of the overflights is still a little bit coarse for being able to extract out individual species from the canopy, as has been done successfully in the Leaf to Landscape project that the Sequoia National Park and Professor Greg Asner have done in the southern Sierras. But we can identify that the oaks and the ponderosa pine are really quite different with their LWC and NDWI. And at the highest elevation, this is getting up into the Teakettle, you can see that the species are really all quite mixed with their leaf water potential and NDWI. And so this is perhaps emblematic at the site level of some of the problems that we were running into with regards to the noise within the plots by treatment being as high as the noise between the plots on 10-year-old treatments. But we do see that incense cedar, the cade, is perhaps the most differentiated, those purple dots going off to the left. So while the individual site results here also, to my mind, leave something to be desired, when we put them all together, we do find that the leaf water content versus the spectral indices of the species from the San Joaquin and the soaproot and the Teakettle can track fairly well between a leaf water content of grams per centimeter squared and the NDWI values. So this does revert back to the concept that at the landscape scale, we have a fairly robust measure. If we had more data, we might be able to get better estimates of the actual leaf water content in the canopy, and that's perhaps another step in future research here. So while I've mentioned a number of things that are still in progress, Phil Van Mancham, who is a co-PI on this project, has some results from long-term demographic data that I would like to bring to your attention. And basically, these are locations that have been measured, I think, quite a few times, and pre and post-fire. So here's what the stand density looks like for when you stratify by those values. And the probability of death being lower in burn stands after accounting for tree size and group. So you can see that the probability declines for the pines after the prescribed fire in these demographic plots. So contrary to the results from Teakettle, here we're seeing that perhaps these fires are beneficial in trying to insulate the pines from the ongoing drought. So jumping back now to the GIS data for just a few more ideas of our next steps. We have stand treatments, we have climate data and models, we have environmental data, and building those into a landscape model and using the remote sensing to try to validate that, or using the remote sensing to build a model and then trying to translate it over to perhaps Landsat are steps that we would like to take next. And then we also have, there's other data. So here's a view of the 2016 tree mortality surveys, the aerial surveys, the ADS surveys, and which also occur in Oregon and Washington and many parts of the United States, flown by the Forest Service. And in California, they're a combined state and federal initiative. And so here in the background is a change in climatic water deficit. So this is a GIS model that we produce here. And the change from a standard 30-year average to the average of the 2013 to 2015 drought, that's the red to blue in the background. And then the black is the level of tree mortality, conifer mortality, that has occurred. And you can see that there are, in the southern Sierra, down at the bottom of the image, the black is occurring in some of the reddest locations. And the black just south of Lake Tahoe is occurring in less intensively drought-stricken areas. And perhaps there may be a difference in the proportion of trees killed by beetles versus by direct physiological impacts between those two areas. So this could be a way that we could start to identify different types of impacts in different locations. And then finally, here's that same climatic water deficit change in the background for the whole Sierra Nevada. And here are our two flight lines with the change in canopy water content between 2013 and 2015. And so looking to see how we might be able to link or how good is the correspondence between the loss of canopy water index as measured through our hyperspectral and a model of landscape hydrology and the change in the background hydrology could be another way that we might be able to get into predictive modeling about future levels of physiological stress on these different tree species, or on these different vegetation types, I should say. Now, you know, a lot of this was centered on the hypothesis that if we are able to somehow reintroduce land management techniques like prescribed burning to large areas, that those areas would become more resilient to these types of perturbations. But of course, there will be barriers to those that can include the funding, and in California, air quality is a big issue because state air quality agencies regulate how much federal forest lands are permitted to burn. The timing of the burning, the site accessibility, rough terrain as often cannot be treated, and then prescribed fire may not be sufficiently severe, and hotter droughts may produce stresses that exceed the potential management responses. So these are some of the sort of the management challenges and questions. And I'd like to leave you then with perhaps a framework for how we're thinking about all of this, that we have forest plots with the water potential and remote sensing by experimental sites, or remote sensing in landscape samples, landscape levels, GIS integrations. I talked a bit about those. There's fire suppression, no treatment, prescribed burns, mechanical thinning. Are there other techniques that we might be able to use? And then what trend information is critical? What condition information is important? And what future projections would be needed to pull those together? And finally, the bottom box of some other questions. What experimental treatments and at what scale and what monitoring would ratchet forward our understanding so that we don't merely look at the response of perturbations or the projections of future impact, but we try to integrate those so that we have a way to advance our understanding even when management techniques might not do what we would hope they would do. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and take any questions that may be out there.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I see a few people typing away. I just want to say real quick, thank you for the presentation, and I'd also like to thank USGS for continuing this webinar series with us, and the last 10 months with this particular drought-specific series. I want to thank everybody there, Holly and Kate and Sean and everyone who's participated in this and helped put this on. We will be taking a 2-month break, so be on the lookout for future webinars. We have another series that we're planning right now. All right, so we got a first question from Johnny. Did you see any interaction with time since burn and drought effects in terms of mortality response?
So we mostly have been trying to look at the flip side of that, and the flip side would be the idea of resilience or locations that had less impact. So there are some publications that are out there for sure. I'm going to back up. So here's the mortality as measured across the state, and Greg Asner has a nice paper in PNAS where they made projections about mortality, and these aerial detection surveys from the Forest Service, the annual tree mortality, the 2016 says that 102 million trees, and it's probably surpassed that now. The great majority of those die by insect. And so we don't have, I would say we don't have a good measure of that, but we recognize that we need it because the NDWI can be saturated by, or can be affected by the number of trees that are actually in a pixel, or the proportion of a pixel that is in a green, similar to NDWI. So we recognize that that is a potentially confounding factor in these measurements.
Okay. And if anybody's on the phone line, if you'd like to throw out a question, you can press *6 on your phone, and that should unmute you if you have any questions.
Hey, Jim. This is Tony Lynn. Great to hear this work. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about any kind of signs of fire refugia that you found. There's really neat work happening in the Pacific Northwest on this. And maybe just know about, in general, what is being seen in the state, even from not just from your work, but
fire refugia?
yeah. So thinking about not just managing places so they don't burn as much, but places that are naturally not burning as much, and then do we put our prescribed burns there, or think about putting them elsewhere, in fact?
Yeah, great question. Good to hear your voice. So we're interested in, I think that the work that is here, these resources. So one of the things we learned last Thanksgiving, almost a year ago now, from a stakeholder meeting was that, hey, wow, if you can just create the entire flight box and give us 4 years of consecutive June values, that we might be able to explore, various different applications of these hyperspectral data. So that's been one of the main focuses. And going after refugia in that location is something that we're interested to do, starting from sort of a climatic perspective. So from a perspective of, are there places that seem to have just had less canopy moisture loss than others, and what are the characteristics of the physical characteristics of those places, because that will be, of course, interacting with the management of those locations. But if we can do that by veg type, then we might be able to identify some fire refugia. I think fire is keenly on the minds of people in California. It's quite smoky outside here in Davis today, even though the coastal fires have died down now a bit. But the combination of 4 years of drought and then double precip that brought the thatch up in many of our more arid systems, so there was a huge annual fuel load that was out there, and then very dry conditions have led to some of the sweeping wildfires that have been in the news. And those types of combinations in California, it makes me wonder whether perhaps we're moving out of sort of a gradual, our models of gradual climate change and the increasing stress that brings, and into some of the more stochastic events that are broadly predicted under climate change, right? So, 4 years of drought and then double rain and then an extremely dry and fire season and high winds, those things within a 5-6 year period seem to be pointing us to those greater extremes. One thing that I am kind of interested to do is to try to align look for spatial correspondence between measures of, say, future climate exposure, so like some of the climate exposure maps that we've developed in California, lay those over the annual maps and say, what was the 2016-2017 year? What did that look like relative to our projections into the future of increasing stress? And so, was 2016-17 sort of the equivalent of a mean condition in 2050 or something like that? And so then we might be able to start to get a handle on what some of these outlier conditions bring to us. In terms of the actual, I guess you could say that the places that retain the most canopy moisture might become the fire refugia, but I really, I think we could go around on that one in a couple of different directions.
Totally. Thanks. Yeah, there's just really Meg Krawcheck and some others up in the Northwest are thinking about this in a way that very different than I think about climate change refugia, but taking into account topography and then looking at historical data to see places that have, kind of remained unburned and what's the pattern there. And so it's cool. It's maybe we can all join forces or something.
That would be great. Yeah. I'd love to work with Meg and with you. And thanks so much for the question.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Tony. All right. Well, with that, I don't see any questions in the chat box. Once again, I'd like to thank Mr. Thorne for your presentation. And like I said, it will be available shortly on the USGS website. So be on the lookout for that if you know somebody that didn't have a chance to view this. And thank you very much for participating. Have a good day.
Great. Thank you, sir.